it's a necessary tool for understanding each other, whether as neighbouring states, as trading partners, or for some other reason. It's a principal source of ideas for innovation and change. Change occurs in every constitutional system, but it's urgent in transitions from authoritarianism or in post-conflict settlements, for which comparative understanding can be formative if properly used. Comparative constitutional law also offers insights into the constitutional conditions of our own polities, their strengths and weaknesses, their assumptions and prejudices. And it provides the necessary foundation for the effective evolution of international law, whether through treaty, custom, or the incremental creep that accompanies the activities of many international bodies. Each of those four purposes has a critical role to play in the future of our highly complex, deeply interdependent world, rife with latent and actual conflict within and between states, and facing the urgent need for collective action to tackle existential threats, including climate change. Comparative constitutional law offers only one set of tools for this purpose, but they're significant. How significant depends on how well they're deployed. The insights gained and the conclusions drawn from any comparative project need to be robust. And this in turn takes us to the first piece of the grand puzzle of comparative constitutional law. Now, there are similarities and differences between all constitutional systems. Comparativists differ in the extent to which they emphasise similarity or focus on difference. Similarity is linked to the assumption of universalism, which underpinned the traditional understanding of comparative law as working towards the harmonisation of law around a common standard. Universalism, in turn, was encouraged by Enlightenment theories, imbued with expectations of where such standards would be found. In the complex constitutional world of the 21st century, other more fine-grained comparative approaches also are in play. But universalism remains influential, and globalisation reinforces the potential for convergence that it implies. The forces for convergence in the current phase of globalisation are familiar. Extraordinary advances in information technology provide instant access to information about the constitutions of the world. Intense transnational human action for a whole range of purposes provide both the opportunity and the incentive to draw on this knowledge in reshaping constitutional systems when the occasion to do so arises. And such occasions arise often. More than 2/3 of the states of the world have made new constitutions over the past 30 years, or significantly altered old ones. Less dramatically, but no less significantly, global constitutional knowledge also influences the evolution of constitutions in other ways through judicial interpretation or political innovation. Now, these forces have influenced scholarship in ways that both build on convergence and contribute further to it. A new genre of comparative constitutional study has emerged, relying on quantitative analysis of the texts of large numbers of constitutions, drawing conclusions from it that offer new generalised insights and assume significant similarity. New theories that purport to have global application circulate readily on issues ranging from constitutional identity to the interpretive methods of constitutional courts. All of this has hastened a process of global constitutional convergence that in fact has been underway since at least the age of empire building and colonisation, and of course we can move further back. So as a result, at one level at least, much of the world now shares a concept of a constitution as a written instrument that organises all public power and draws its authority from the people in a centralised state. An instrument that chooses from a similar set of options for the ways in which public power is organised, that legitimises lawmaking through electoral democracy, that provides for independent judicial review, and that assumes the constitutional relevance of a shared catalogue of human rights standards. And constitutional comparison is easier to this extent. So much for the case for convergence. Now for the qualifications. The indicators of convergence that I've touched on so far are deceptive. The real stuff of constitutional law and practice lies below those generalities. The operation and outcomes of constitutional systems ultimately are what matters to the people affected by them. And these depend on a host of factors that are less tangible and less accessible than the constitutional text and institutional design, even when these are identical, which almost never is the case. Some factors are linked to the Constitution itself: interpretation, supporting laws, legal system, constitutional theory, constitutional culture. And others concern the context in which the Constitution operates and in which it must work, including geographic and population size, social and economic development, homogeneity or otherwise, and priorities for state action. Many of these factors and their impact on constitutional arrangements are challenging to grasp for comparative purposes. We can learn some things by drawing on textual similarities. Often, however, and perhaps usually, this is not enough for the implied purposes that I outlined earlier. A topical, if perhaps oversimplified example makes the point. A global survey can tell us, and it does, that there's been a rapid increase in the number of constitutions of the world that mention the environment. This is good news as far as it goes. It provides evidence of some convergence of constitutional text, and perhaps also of priorities and values. But how good the news is depends on other things: what the constitutional text requires, how it works, and whether it makes a difference in practice. For questions like these, more complex inquiries are needed, however difficult this may be on a global scale. Matching comparative technique to comparative purpose is one of the enduring challenges of the field. Now, superimposed on this already complex picture, and with distinctive characteristics of its own, is the companion idea of internationalisation. And I use this as a compendious term for the expansion of the reach of international law and the deepening of its techniques for self-enforcement. There's every sign that international law will continue to develop along both these dimensions. How this occurs in practice varies between international law regimes, each of which has developed its own modalities, reflecting the phenomenon of fragmentation. Subject to this caveat, where the subject matter of international law is constitutional in character, as in relation to rights, to take only one obvious example, it contributes to the perception of constitutional convergence. And in this situation, the converging norms draw additional moral force from the legitimacy of international law. While internationalisation has implications for the constitutions of all states, it affects some states more than others, in ways that parallel the de facto inequality of states in the international order. States that receive support from UN agencies in peace and/or constitution making will be under greater pressure to adopt international norms in their constitutions than others. States that are dependent on international or regional financial assistance, generally or for specific purposes, will face similar pressures of this kind. And states that lack bargaining power in international investment arrangements may be obliged to accept the constitutional norms of more powerful states. In an example of the uneven impact of internationalisation of a completely different kind, member states of transnational regional bodies will be far more constitutionally constrained by regional norms and processes than states that are not. The most advanced case of regional integration so far is the European Union. Not surprisingly, the EU has been the source of an extraordinary outpouring of comparative constitutional scholarship, prompted by the intriguing new constitutional questions that integration presents. But neither these questions nor the answers to them apply elsewhere in the world. regional integration is underway elsewhere as well, including in Africa and Latin America. But it takes different forms in different regions, which impact differently on the constitutions of the member states. Ironically, regionalisation, which inevitably involves convergence, has added an additional source of diversity between regions, which comparative projects must take into account. And there are parts of the world that are barely regionalised at all, where this source of convergence does not apply, and the Asia-Pacific region is the principal case in point. Now, so far, this story of the spread and impact of internationalisation is simply part of the larger story of constitutional convergence in our time, the depth of which is undetermined and which has patchy operation. But over the last decade or so, internationalisation has been reinforced by another strand of thought, sometimes termed global constitutionalism. The central tenet of global constitutionalism is that the international order itself is developing constitutional characteristics. Proponents point, for example, to a conception of the rule of law at the international level, to institutions that seem broadly to exercise legislative, executive and judicial functions, and to nascent mechanisms for accountability. It's not necessary for present purposes to pursue the extent to which this perception of global constitutionalism is a reality. On any view, it's a long way from the kind of constitutionalism that operates in mature constitutional democracies. Some aspects of state-based constitutionalism, including democracy itself, are unlikely ever to be achieved at the international level. My interest rather is in the implications of global constitutionalism for national constitutions and comparative constitutional law. On at least some accounts, global constitutionalism treats national constitutions as satellites of a global constitutional order. Again, on this account, national constitutions become a catalyst for global constitutionalism in at least two ways. First, an assumption of the convergence of national constitutions encourages the view that they can be readily subsumed beneath an overarching international constitutional umbrella. And an assumption of a different kind, the democratic responsibility at the state level has been hollowed out by globalisation, is used to justify both the constitutionalisation of the international order and the progressive transfer of power to it. Exactly what this means for national constitutions is not developed by these theories, which typically emanate from international or supranational legal scholarship. Nevertheless, they imply both a rationale and a procedure for the continuing convergence of national constitutions. They encourage and add legitimacy to the already extensive practice of external support to national constitution building projects. And potentially, they change the very concept of a constitution as a fundamental law for a state that depends for its form, operation and legitimacy on the state of its people to one that draws its authority from international law.